World without government. Say you're at a mall. It's looking like a mall. You see people going around the shops with the bags, and you got security guards walking around every once in a while. You'll have a little wet floor sign here, and looking pretty normal. Notice there's no video game stores because video games are all free or donation based because there are no copyright laws anymore. Hardware is still sold, and the best video games are actually hardwired into systems, and that's how really good games still get made. But online flash games are the main source of video games nowadays. You want food? You want food because you're a little hungry after working for 4 hours at a fast food place at $25 an hour that morning. So you're a little hungry. You work 4 hours a day, 3 days a week. So you go to the sushi bar and put in a $3 silverback note, and the robots prepare 6 bars of taco sushi. No tax, because everything's really cheap, and there's no inflation. The mall has private security, but because nobody is desperate, material crime is almost unheard of, although crimes of passion are still around. You want some crack? Well, this mall you're at doesn't allow for hard drugs to be sold, although you can still get marijuana. If you want crack, you're going to have to go out of the mall, go to some standalone store. You'll have to cross a picket line with a bunch of people who think it's immoral and stuff and face their dirty looks. But you can buy it, and it's still a lot cheaper than it was during the age of the state. Crime's hardly a problem at all, since the effort to plan and the risk of getting caught so much outweighs the effort needed to work for, half a day to get $100. This is all fine and dandy, but we live in a world of states. And anarchy land, would be a stateless society, would be very susceptible to invasion by another state. Well, invasion isn't that much of a problem. The home you live in anarchy land, has a restrictive covenant. That is, you must pay for the defense of the city. In order to buy the house, you got to pay for defense. If you want to sell the house, you have to pay. That person you're selling it to has to agree to pay for the defense of the city. The defense consists of 2 nukes that are maintained in a silo 30 miles outside the city. Countries with nukes today don't get invaded, okay? And no other state with a nuclear weapon has ever been invaded. Curious how countries with nukes seem to cause a lot less problems for the United States than countries without nukes. Countries without nukes seem to be a lot more militant and show up in the president's speeches and on the mainstream media a lot more than countries with nukes. And let's say China did invade your community, did invade anarchy land. Well, what would China get? They couldn't just get a government to surrender because there is no government. They'd show up, riding their tanks, and then it would be like, okay, we're here, now what? Much like when Napoleon arrived in Moscow. Would the Chinese go house by house grabbing plasma television screens and everything of value? I mean, would they just invade anarchy land just to get material possessions? Really? Plus, the people in your town knew the Chinese were coming to show up, so they took everything of value that they could, and everything they couldn't bring, they just burned to the ground. So the invading army shows up, tries to get some government to surrender, but there is no government, just a bunch of burned out houses and a few burned out cars. Society has been reduced to its component parts in nothing flat. Now let's say you are a member of a neighboring town and a bunch of refugees from the city China attacked come in. Well, you have no problem feeding them. That's hardly an issue in a stateless society. But you now have millions of people in the surrounding area all pissed at the Chinese. And they all have nukes, biological weapons. The Chinese have achieved nothing by, quote, conquering, close quote, one town, and the surrounding townsmen are all foaming at the mouth. In anarchy, every war is a guerrilla war. Imagine trying to fight a guerrilla war in what we now call the United States. Without a state, war is a pretty irrelevant enterprise. So, material crime is not a problem. State invasion is hardly a problem. What about terrorism? Well, the way you prevent terrorist attacks is to just not allow Muslims at your airport, not allow certain types of people at airports, shipyards, rail lines. Sorry if that sounds harsh, but that would be my airline of choice, and I'd probably pay a little bit more to get on an airline that said no Muslims on this airline. And I know a lot of people who feel the same way. That option is not available today, because if you put a sign on any establishment saying no Muslims, the state, which is supposed to protect you from Muslims, will attack you. Will attack you for protecting yourself from Muslims, saying it's hate speech or your racial profiling is illegal or something stupid like that. And even at the airports, the TSA fails its own tests more than half the time, meaning a TSA agent will call in ahead of time, strap a mock bomb to his chest, and try to get through the security station. The TSA fails these tests more often than it succeeds. And since most terrorists, I don't think are going to call in ahead of time, we can assume that at least 50% of all attempted bomb plots at airports in the United States have succeeded. All 0 of them. Nuclear weapons in a free society? Well, without governments, we would have a bunch of loose nukes all over the place. It's true. Without governments, you would have a bunch of loose nukes floating around all over the world. We know this because there are a bunch of loose nukes floating around all over the world right now. Maybe you haven't heard of this. Maybe states have been very good at covering this up. But the USSR broke up, and there are a bunch of unaccounted for nukes. Nukes that people literally just don't know where they are. Kind of whoops. Also, keep in mind that states created nukes. States are the only institutions that have used nukes, and there are nukes floating around because of state incompetence. There are also a bunch of chemical weapons floating around from the collapse of Iraq. This is like the hash of war. This is the fog and friction of war. Just you do something and you don't know what's going to happen. They invaded Iraq. Oh, now there's a bunch of biological weapons all over the place. Good going. So states created these weapons. States lost control of them and is currently using violence against any citizen who takes realistic steps to protect himself from these kinds of weapons. And it doesn't take a genius to realize this. None of the stuff I say in my videos are genius stuff. It's just stepping back, looking at what happened, and moving on from there. I know there are more details than that, but if you wish to say that those details make my superficial analysis incorrect, then that version is on you. What about the poor? In Anarchy Land, you may ask, to which I ask, what poor? In Anarchy Land, there are like 100 poor people in the entire city of 1 million. And I spend $10 a year to a welfare fund that takes care of all of them just fine. What about the lower class that needs medical care? Well, medical care is now across the board a quarter as expensive as it was before, and real wages have tripled, and people regularly are able to become doctors by the time they're 22 due to private education and no longer having to spend 12 years mandatory. Now, there are still some less fortunate people who still cannot afford that operation. Probably not. Because let's say that despite these cataclysmic reductions in medical costs in relation to wages, you still have a guy who cannot afford heart surgery. Well, what would you do as a hospital? Would you help this guy out pro bono since you're now making many times what you were before? And if a single hospital were to turn this guy down, would he be able to find another hospital that would accept him? And would that hospital be able to use their benevolence as an advertising coup against the hospital that turned him down? And the time it took him to look for another hospital, is that more or less than the time spent in some statist maze of office supplies? This is the emergent web of society. No assembly required, no state necessary. Who will build the roads? What roads? Now that the roads aren't subsidized, you have to pay for roads based on how much you use them. Now that you have a choice to pay for them or not, do you want to pay for roads or just take the train? Especially now that trains are a lot cheaper since roads are no longer being subsidized, and so they're more competitive, more people invest in them, and so now it makes a lot more sense to take the train. And trains are a lot cheaper in relation to roads and in relation to your real wages. How is your safety provided on a train? Well, either with their own guards or with guards they hired from a defense agency. Does this worry you? Why? Would you prefer state guards who are much more difficult to fire? If guards in that train, if guards that the train line hires start harassing you, the train line can just fire those guards. There's a whole web of society that exists that emerges without a state, with layers to fall back on and negative feedback mechanisms to different organizations. This is real protection. This is real safety. This was what made the Mild West so mild. It's not the illusion of safety, and solidness that a state provides. All a state does is pervert the pre-existing web of humanity. All these things exist right now. Anarchy is what we live. Anarchy is the functional part of our lives. And supposed market failures always have to do with some state meddling. And when you think about it, how else could we get wars? Do people want wars? Is there a demand for wars? Is there a big old demand for wars? No. And this is why you don't see these things unless you open the Pandora's box of fantasy, the state, which is a cancer. It is a perversion of society. Yes, it emerges from human interaction just like everything else, because that is the only place it could possibly come from. Cancer can only come from the human body. It is a perversion of the emergent order, just like slavery, ritual rape, and genital mutilation.